Good afternoon, art students. This is Mr. Verzat, and today we're going to look at pre-drawing from reference. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means how do you get your drawing to accurately look like what you are drawing? For example, a reference could be a real object in front of you. It could be a photograph of an object. It could be a person. It could be something out of your imagination. But in this example, our reference is going to be something that's in front of you. How do you accurately reproduce on paper what you see in front of you? We've previously touched several of these elements in other screencasts and other examples of techniques, but we're just going to go over it, and some of it might be review, but hey, let's dive right in. For starters, let's look at the picture right here. This is a picture of a bird, and a lot of you guys can already pick out the technique used. You're just turning parts of the bird into basic shapes to help you draw the bird. Okay? So here are examples of those basic shapes, kind of separated apart, floating in space, so to speak. And as you can see, let's take a look at the beak. That looks nothing like the bird's beak. Well, that's because it's just a road map. It's there to help guide you. Now, you're not confined within the bounds of that little triangle that you drew. It's just there to help your mind save some energy about placement of the forms within your subject. And remember, a subject means what you're drawing. So the bird is our subject. All right, so going through the steps, first of all, you can replicate anything by turning it into basic shapes. The way that you do that, you find the most in-your-face, obvious shape, and in my case, that would be kind of an egg shape for the bird. If we were to actually draw kind of an egg shape around that, that would kind of be the general shape of the bird. But then again, how do you make sure that that egg shape is accurate? Because remember, if you're a beginning artist, your egg shape might look like a beach ball, because you haven't learned how to control your tools yet. Well, that's where this example comes into play. All right, what you do is you pick a shape, any shape that you want. Say the head. All right, and in this example, I used the head, and you think, how many heads would I be able to stack on top of each other within that photograph of that bird in order to see how big my drawing's going to be? That's what we call using a fixed point of reference in your piece. You find a fixed point that you use as a guide for how big your picture is going to be, and we'll get into more detail on that later. I'm actually going to show you how to do it physically. And what you can do is you don't just necessarily stick to that fixed point of reference. You might get to a point in your drawing where you need to change and find a different reference point, and that's okay. You can bounce around and do that. And again, for pre-drawing, you just basically stack all those shapes on top of each other, kind of like a sandwich. You're not really sticking a head on top of an oval. You're sticking the head overlapping on top of the oval. Because if you look at the bird, its head overlaps on top of the oval down here. Moving right along, let's look at some non-examples of this. Here are examples of what not to do. And again, just kind of going into beginner work. Let's look at this top bird here. That basic shape for the body doesn't look anything like the reference. It takes practice. One of the ways that you can help in order to get accurate drawings like that, if you can't control your arm, is use that overhand hold. That helps you see where you're going better. Also, keep it light and sketchy. If it's light and sketchy, you can afford to make a couple of mistakes in your drawing, and then it'll eventually stabilize itself as you continue to go over the surface like that. This one down here in the bottom, common mistake of evidence of not thinking while you're doing it. This is a process where you're actively involved. This is where you're laying the foundation of your house, so to speak. So if you look at this bird here, it's very narrow. The wing kind of sticks up off of the body. It's flat and two-dimensional. The forms don't really overlap. Try to have your forms overlap. So let's move on to another example. All right, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just go through a couple of steps on how to accurately draw your subject by measuring parts of it against itself, meaning you find that reference point within your form and you use that as a guide to see how big the rest of your subject is going to be. So what you do, you find that fixed reference point within your subject to measure the rest of your forms against it for proportion. Now, proportion means an accurate rendering of its form. If I were out of proportion, my head could be the size of a beach ball and my body the size of a small little toothpick. There are times for that in art, such as cartooning, caricature, or art where you're making fun of things. But if you're trying to draw accurately, that's not the time for it. So let's take a look and see how we can measure this rabbit in such a way that we can get an accurate drawing of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick a fixed point of reference, and just for the heck of it, I think I'm going to pick the ear over here. Why the ear? Well, you know, why not? You could pick anything you want. You could pick the eye if you wanted. You could pick the head. The eye would be difficult because it's so small. Well, the ear is a nice kind of medium-sized shape, and I'm just going to what I'm going to do is I'm going to use it to find out how tall my drawing is. In my mind, I would be imagining how tall this ear is. Alright? So how many of these ears could we stack on top of each other in order to find out how tall the rabbit is? Well, we could do 1, 2. Boy, and he's just about 3 ears in height. So what you could do on your paper is you could physically, if you want to reproduce an image that's the same size as the thing that you're looking at, man, you could physically like get your fingers over there, measure the size of the ear, and stack them on top of each other. Actually, you saw that in one of my video demonstrations. If you haven't, you will. So once you've figured out how tall your form is, you just continue drawing all the forms. So step 2, continue drawing all the forms you can until the general layout of your subject is finished. Your blueprint is basically laid out. Light, loose, and sketchy. Alright, so let's do that. So once again, I'm just going to start from scratch here. Let's measure the height of the ear. You know, he is 1, 2, and you don't need a ruler for this. You can just eyeball it. Just under 3 ears in height. So as I'm drawing, I would have that in mind. So you just start with a general layout of your form using basic shapes. And remember to overlap those shapes just like so. All right. Think of a sub-sandwich. Okay, now I'm going to run into a little problem here. His body extends beyond his ear, so when I go to draw his body, I'm going to think, okay, how far past his ear does the outside of his little body here extend? And I see it goes by a little bit. So when I go to draw my oval, I want to be aware of that it does extend beyond my reference point here. And this is nice and sloppy. It's mainly because I'm using a tablet. For you guys, your lines aren't going to be all bold like this. This is just because of the technology that I'm using. Remember to keep your lines nice and light, very light, almost a pressure 1 lightness. Okay, so here's a completed. Really, it really looks sloppy on the computer. Apologize for that. But here's, just finish your layout and you kind of keep working at it until it's scaled. Constantly keep looking back at your subject to make sure that it's accurate, so that we don't get those really nasty looking drawings like I showed you in the non-examples. So the final steps in your work is just to finish the drawing. And how do you do that? Well, we'll get in more detail later as the year goes. But you stabilize your line work while still keeping it light and sketchy, just like in that demonstration that I showed you. Next, you would add value to it, different shades of gray with a light source to make it look realistic. After that, you would add detail next. All the whiskers, the hairs, the textures. That comes after you've added your value. And then you do the finishing touches. So you could increase the darkness in some areas and increase the lightness in some areas to make it look really cool. We call that adding or subtracting contrast. And finally, you clean the piece up. Any smudges that you have on your paper, you erase those. You get rid of them. Any pre-drawing lines that are still visible, you erase those. You get rid of it. You clean the piece up, you make it presentable and ready to turn in. All right? So, applications. How does this work? Why do you want to have an accurate rendering? Well, for starters, it looks good, but here's another reason why, and I think you might like it. We call it scaling, and I don't mean like snake scales. I mean scaling something up. If you have a small reference that you're looking at, you could make a huge drawing out of it using this technique. We call it upscaling. The end result is a lot larger than the thing that you looked at. So simply by measuring your forms against each other, you could get a really large drawing. Likewise, if you had a very large subject, but you had a really small piece of paper to get the drawing on, you can shrink it that way too. Seriously. It's just like using that grid technique that you may have learned in art back in junior high, but this is far more effective because it's taken place in your head. And if you can learn to measure your forms against itself in everything that you do, you will have a very strong spatial awareness. And so that when you go to draw something out of your imagination, it's going to be all the stronger because you exercise that muscle in your brain. All right? So, hope this was helpful. And again, as always, feel free to rewind the video if there's something you missed and don't understand. And we'll go over it more in class. And I look forward to seeing you.